You're a church planner. You're an author. Your new book's coming out. The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. How to stay emotionally and healthily, spiritually alive in the world of chaos of the modern world. You wrote another book. My Name is Hope: Anxiety, Depression, and Life After Melancholy. And this seems like something that is very kind of dear to your heart. Like, this is stuff that you've struggled with and walked through. And would you mind kind of telling us your story about this a little bit, and hurry and anxiety and all those things that come with ministry?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's an all too familiar trope, So my story is kind of the classic story. Every pastor's conference you go to, there's some story about burnout and, early midlife crisis and all of that. But yeah, I mean, it's very similar to that pattern that I think has something to do with just the human soul, but that is exacerbated by American culture and the way that a lot of church planting culture, a lot of mega church culture has kind of crept into the church. And, or specifically like the American metrics for success have crept into the church. And so, yeah, I planted a church in my early 20s, and it grew very, very fast, and was the whole thing just sucked in. And it was a wild ride. It was beautiful, and there's all sorts of wonderful things, some of which were Jesus, others of which were other things, but a lot of which was Jesus and was beautiful. But yeah, I hit about 30 and just crashed. There was a number of things. Yeah. There was like an emotional, kind of mental health, emotional crash where I had become just to say in a hurry would be like the understatement of the year. Stressed out, unhappy, grouchy, on edge. There was a spiritual kind of crash and crisis. And I realized that I had hit this plateau in my spiritual formation, or whatever language you want to put that around that, and kind of my growth into Christ-likeness. I felt like my high school years and through college and even in my early 20s had this sense of year over year of growth, like I was becoming more like Jesus. But I really, interesting, I kind of hit this point where I just felt like I stalled out in that growth and hit a plateau, and even began to regress the moment that my discipleship to Jesus, one, entered adulthood and just the pressure and stress of adulthood, career, life, leadership, responsibility, and two, began to then have to face, not just what the early followers of Jesus called the gross sins, meaning like the main ones, like murder and adultery and lying, but like the really deeply ingrained stuff in my personhood, my family of origin, my personality, my like neurochemistry, the way I'm wired. Like the second my life with Jesus began to hit that, it's like all of a sudden the tools that I was using, or kind of the way that I was following Jesus, was almost powerless. And I felt like I was just banging my head against this wall, So if anything, I was becoming less loving and joyful and peaceful year over year, not more. And so there's that spiritual crisis. And then there's a leadership crisis. Like I just began to like really make mistakes as a leader. And there was no moral failure or church split necessarily or anything like that. But I was just an emotionally unhealthy leader. I was leading out of anger and reactivity and criticism, perfectionism, ambition and ego, weak identity, like all the kind of classic stuff. I was not, in Friedman's language, a non-anxious presence. So it all kind of built to a head. And about 6 years ago now, I basically resigned from the church I was leading, and we had become a kind of family of churches, multi-church kind of model. Yeah. And so I didn't quit and abandon the church. I just basically, I had been leading 3 or 4 different churches and said, how about I just quit all of that and just lead one in the city, which was much smaller than the other ones. And so, I went on sabbatical. In the last 5 years, I've just been a very kind of deep dive into spiritual formation, emotional health, neuroscience, the life of the soul, prayer, the spiritual disciplines, growth, Christ-likeness, love, freedom, nation, indifference, becoming a non-anxious presence, and it's lifelong journey stuff. So I have by no stretch of the imagination even come close to arrived on any of those levels, but it feels really, really good to kind of be on a totally new trajectory, very different metrics for success now, very different way of life. And so that's kind of where I'm at, what I'm trying to figure out in my own life, and really trying to help other people in general figure out how do we live emotionally healthy and spiritually just aware. I love Henry Nouwen's thing, the job of a pastor is the opposite of distraction. It's to teach people how to slow down and focus.
And I feel like, as pastors, I was a pastor for 15 years. Jason has planted a church about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago?
Yeah, it'll be 2 years next week.
Yeah. And I feel like, and John Mark,
man.
You probably felt this too. And like, I think for so many pastors, we find ourselves doing the exact opposite of what Nouwen says. We end up, we live life as pastors that are running and gunning, going as hard as we can. And I think what ends up happening is we end up coming, and I don't know if you felt like this, I'd love for you to speak to this. And Jason, even if you have a question, like, we end up becoming these professionals that are very good at growing an organization, but somehow in the midst of that, if we're not careful, kind of what you said, we can lose our souls a little bit in it.
Yeah. Oh, 100%, which is, catastrophic because, it's Scazzero's line, as the leaders go, so goes the church. And that's just, of course, riffing off all of Paul's theology of leadership, which is follow me as I follow Christ, or imitate me as I imitate Christ. He says something to that effect like 4 times in his epistles. And, most of us read that and think, well, that's so presumptuous. Or, if we have shoddy theology, we say, well, he could say that because he's Paul or something, as if he's like superhuman because he is an author of Corinthians or something. But man, the more I'm around it, the more I realize that is what leadership is. And the leadership in the way of Jesus is all about example and invitation. And if I can't say, follow Jesus the way I'm following Jesus to people in my city and my generation, then I have very, little to offer. And it's so funny, like we do, like most churches, we do some kind of like a, welcome to the church kind of class.
Yeah.
And as the opening like session, we do all this stuff. I used to, start off this class with like your classic big vision pitch, like in Portland as it is in heaven, and we want to see the kingdom of God, and here's your part in the church. It's like a rah kind of,
we've all been there.
Church planning. Yeah,
I'm actually giving that same talk this coming Sunday. So
yeah, totally. Sorry, dude. Oh, but that's what so much of church planning is. It's just like rah on top of an already over busy, stressed out life, and that's a short-term solution for church planning. And it works well at gathering a crowd. It doesn't work well at establishing a long-term, faithful community in an urban context. And so it's so funny. We've now come 180 degrees to now, our opening talk, we start with Matthew 11, and Jesus, come to me, all who are weary and tired. And I'll think we read the Eugene Peterson translation, and the rhythms of grace, and it's beautiful. His paraphrase of that is so good. And we just basically talk about an antidote to the hurry and busyness and anxiety and exhaustion of our culture. And then are just really simple, we're going to ask you to do some stuff to be a part of our church, but we're not asking you to do more. We're actually asking you to do less. This is not about addition to your already over busy life. It's about subtraction. So what are, 3 things that you can cut out of your life in order to follow Jesus as a part of our community? And it's a bit sobering, but I think hopefully loving and kind and compassionate. But that's become our new manifesto in the city is slow down, simplify your life around practicing the way of Jesus in community, and live from a deep center of prayer and unhurried awareness, And man, that is so hard to do, but that's our new, the rah-rah is gone. And now it's all right, everybody, take a deep breath, So just kind of, I want to wrap this up, but how would you, John Mark, how would you tell someone, because one of the things that we're going to do on this podcast is we have a ton of questions from people that we kind of solicited on Twitter or whatever about this topic and struggle and burnout and all this. How would you tell everybody listening, if you could give them any advice or what you found, how does someone find rest in all this? How do they find a peace in it, I guess is a better question, so they're not burning the candle at both ends? Yeah, man, I love it. Well, I think life is complex. The soul is complex. And our culture is always on the hunt for quick, easy solutions, simple solutions. The killer app, the silver bullet. And unfortunately, there isn't one, and none of this is arrival theology. We don't arrive at, okay, now I'm healthy. It's always a lifelong journey. So I think with that disclaimer, I think, if you kind of view it through the human anthropology of mind, body, social sphere, I think that's a healthy way. Like through your body, like the first place to start is just with your body, like what you actually do with your body as it moves through the universe one day at a time. And I think for me, the two like foundational body practices or spiritual disciplines or habits, whatever you want to call it, or what Peter Simmons called rhythms of grace that anchor my soul at an emotional and spiritual level are morning prayer and a weekly Sabbath. And when I say morning prayer, I don't just mean read through the Bible in the year and do intercessory prayer for 5 minutes. And by Sabbath, I don't just mean go to church. I mean morning sitting before God. And much of my morning prayer is me like sitting this time of year on the back deck in the quiet, you know, just opening my mind to God, processing my emotions before God, reading a psalm, slowly reading one little story in the Gospels. And I still do scripture reading, and often I'll do it at other times, like my read through the Bible in a year stuff, just so that morning time. Like this morning, I woke up, I had a very stressful day yesterday. Tuesday is my kind of marathon meeting day. It's the day of the week I dread. And it fried me, you know, and we have community that night, don't get home till 9 something at night. So by the time I woke up this morning, I was just fried. And much of my time with Jesus this morning was just processing that before God and hearing God's perspective on the day and letting my mind and my body and my limbic system calm down before I go into today, not hurried, but just diligent. You know, so morning prayer for me and times of silence and solitude, and not just reading the Bible or devotional and some quick prayers and then off to the races, but really just taking time to be with God. That's key for me. Like I remember, you know, Henry Nouwen once went to Mother Teresa for spiritual direction, which like to be a fly on the wall, by the way, at that conversation. And, you know, he basically asked her like, how do I do this? I'm tired. I'm exhausted. And she literally gave him one sentence. She said, spend an hour each day. So this is probably not verbatim, but spend an hour each day in adoration of your Lord and never do anything you know is wrong and you'll be fine. That's basically all she said, you know? But there's something, whether it's an hour or whatever, like set aside some of the time dynamics there, though I do think the longer the better. But there's something about just an anchor point each day or each morning in prayer and in quiet where you process before God. And then Sabbath, by that I don't just mean church, but I mean, that's hopefully a part of it, but a full 24-hour time period, which for many of us as pastors has to be on a different day than Sunday or different time slot, just to, you know, the 4 practices of Sabbath: stopping, resting, delighting, and worshiping. A whole day of just nothing but stop, delight, rest, worship. Those 2 things at a body level, you know? Then at a mind level, then one of the things you begin to realize is like if you begin to slow your life down, you know, create a rule of life, practice the spiritual disciplines, morning prayer, Sabbath, all of that, like, you know, there's a massive, in my experience, and in most people I work with, in spiritual direction or whatever, massive like leap forward in emotional health and spiritual life. But people quickly realize, all right, that was like, it got me 40% of the way down, but I'm still a long, long ways to go. And because even when your body's in the right rhythms, your mind, there's still just all this stuff, like deep internal stuff and knotted motivation and insecurity and confusion and doubt and questions about the future and uncertainty, like this stuff that will often, even if our body is going through the world at a healthy pace, often our mind is racing and is disquiet and is out of balance. And so that's where things like therapy and spiritual direction and prayer and reading can really help to order the chaos of the mind and to comfort, I think, in the language of the mind, you know? And then finally is the social sphere. Like you can't do this alone. This is where you need close friends, community, spiritual director or therapist or mentor or pastor, or whatever label or whatever role or angle works best for you or is available to you. I think this has to be something that you do with at least a couple close relationships. So I guess on my level, those are the 3 basic categories of like body. How do I literally just practice the spiritual disciplines with my body, slow my body down? Mind, how do I do the deep, like internal psychological and spiritual work of growth, healing, transformation, freedom from compulsion, all of that, motivation. And then social, how do I like do this in relationships? And who are the 2 or 3 people both ahead of me in the journey with Jesus and with me on the journey with Jesus?
Yeah, it's so good, man.
Do this with, you know?
That's so good. Well, man, that is awesome. And dude, thank you so much. Tell us one more time, when's your new book coming out, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry?
Oh, yeah. It comes out October, 29, something like that, end of October.
Cool. Well, everyone that is listening to this podcast, you need to go get this book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, because if you are in ministry, all three of us on this phone call can attest to the fact that you struggle with rushing and hurry and everything else.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Well, dude, thank you so much, brother. I really appreciate it.
All right, man. Tons of love to both of you. Bye.
So I don't know about you guys, but one of the things that I really liked about that John Mark said, and it's kind of what we've been talking about a lot already on this podcast, is he says, there is not one silver bullet. There is not one thing that just helps us always be healthy. And the other thing that I really liked that he said, because he said that this is a lifelong journey. And I think one of the things that we've all understood, who've, like Bianca said, there's almost 100 years of ministry between the four of us, is this is a lifelong journey. And you can have massive seasons of health and you can have massive seasons of unhealth. And so what have you guys found? I know John Mark, he talked about that he's really got three areas that he looks at. He looks at the mind, the body, and the soul. And he talks about the body being like his morning prayer, sitting outside, really Sabbathing. It like gives him an anchor point. And I thought it was good for me. I actually took a note on this when he said it. When he gave the definition of what the Sabbath is the stopping, the resting. And I love this one, the delighting and the worshiping. I think so many times as pastors, I was actually talking to my counselor about this yesterday, is that we forget that sometimes just enjoying and delighting in what God has given us is sometimes the best type of worship and rest that we can have. And so what have you guys found really in your own personal lives that you would say, man, this has really helped me as a pastor sustain a healthy rhythm? Or maybe you're not even in that place, but you've heard someone say something and you're like, one day I'm going to do that. Like, what is that thing for each of you? Bianca, you can go first because you're a lady, and besides Joel, we're Southern. We're always going to defer, girl.
Man, come on.
Okay. No, I'll jump right in. You know what? There's actually, I've whittled this down recently because someone asked me the same question, and I realized that it's whittled down to three things. I love that John Mark Comer had mentioned body, soul, and spirit or heart. And I think that for me, body's a big thing, and I feel closest to God. I feel like my head is clear when I work out. So I work out about 5 to 6 days a week, and it doesn't have to be like super strenuous, but I love that I get to shut down, that there's no phone, whether it's a run, a swim, whether it's cycle or kickboxing. It's just like that moment that I just get to hear from God in the most untraditional ways, which I love. I grew up in a more of a conservative household, so the idea of therapy was something that was definitely taboo. It was only for certain people or those people, and I have been so excited and so lucky, so blessed to be able to connect with some really great counselors and therapists. And that has been so good for my psyche and soul. And then, the daily discipline. I'm going to sound really old school on this, but like if I don't spend time, whether it's through like prayer or journaling or reading God's word, like I'm a witch, y'all. Like I need to have some Jesus time, or like you will see all the Satan come out. So I would say those are the three things that like are pretty much, if not daily disciplines, and most definitely weekly disciplines. And counselor, I see every other week or once a month, something along those lines.
Yeah. So everything that you said, I think we're trying to do those same things. And, some weeks I feel like I'm doing good at it, like your morning devotions and prayer and working out. And there's some weeks I feel like they get away from you, and so I think I try to do my best with that. But the two big things I would say that I've tried to implement, or I should say three. One is I try to have that weekly Sabbath. And mine's on Fridays typically, is when I try to do that, Fridays or Thursdays. And then the other two things is there's a statement I heard somebody say one time, you're only as sick as your secrets. And so whether that be a counselor or be a really close friend that you can talk to and let them ask you the tough questions. So for me, Josh is one of those people. I have two other friends, and then obviously counselors are always helpful. Those are two things. And then practically this third thing, I was talking to one of my mentors, and he asked me one time, he was like, hey, do you have a hobby? And I was like, yeah, ministry, of course. And he's like, that can't be your hobby, dude. And so now I the two things I love to do is I love to go to Napa Valley and hang out with my wife. We love to do that once a month or once every 2 months because we live close to there. Or I love to play golf. And so doing those things, it kind of just, I disconnect. I don't think about church. I don't think about ministry. I don't think about my kids. Hey, all I think about is me in that moment. And it does something for my soul. Like one day of just unplugging and connecting with God and having fun is really good for me. And so it helps me with that rhythm.
So we've got a bunch of questions. So Relevant actually sent out some questions, polled social media for us. And I have about 4 questions that I think really apply to this soul care that people ask. And I feel like we're, hopefully a pretty good group to answer these questions. And so I just want to kind of go around, quickly get y'all's thoughts on it. I'll kind of conclude a thought at the end. But the first question we got is this, and I think this is a huge one. And Joel, you kind of hit on this earlier. How do we keep marriages and families healthy for those that are in ministry? Because what we see a lot of times is we see mom and dads, husband and wives, and what they're doing. And this is a bad way to say it, but they're sacrificing their families on the altar of ministry. So how do we help people and families? How do we help families stay healthy that are in ministry? What does that look like for you? You live in Australia. You're in America all the time. You got kids, Riv, your wife. Like, what are the things that you're doing personally that is helping your family stay healthy as you pastor?
I think I said it on the text message to you guys earlier today, if that's when it was, I can't remember, but it was like, we've spent the last 10 weeks together, which is the longest in 5 years we've spent together. And I think she's ready to kick me out of the house, because it's been too long. But we really have worked to communicate. If we're not talking, if we're not walking, if we're not doing something together when we are together physically, the one thing I'm concerned by is I walk in the door and I'm on my phone or I'm on something trying to work, and I've tried to put it down. Yeah. So we walk to school every morning at 8:30. The boys have to be at school, and I'm like, let's go walk. And she says, if I have my phone out, she goes, just stay home. And so now my phone's in my pocket. But we'll walk, and it's a 5-minute walk, and we just spend 5 minutes as a family together. And you may go, that sounds silly, but there's no it's a, how's your day looking? And then the same thing happens on the way home. And it's just, we're doing this together. And Riv and I will sit down for like an hour every morning, have coffee together. Then I'll come home and I'll spend time with Jesus. That's what my day looks like. But we've had to put in places when I'm in Australia that I am dad again.
Yeah.
I don't sacrifice I don't sacrifice it. I go, my family is first.
So here's a second question, guys, that we got asked. Ministry is inherently isolating. How do you create or have community and friends that's genuine? Bianca, why don't you go ahead and answer this question for us? Because once again, ladies first.
Okay, so as a 7 on Enneagram, I love to have fun. So it might be a little bit easier. But what I have kind of learned in this process, I've been in ministry for 16 years now. Here's the thing. Like, yes, it is isolating. And yes, it is lonely. But it doesn't hurt to ask someone to be your friend. Sure. That feels so thirsty. That feels so desperate. But the truth of the matter is that like, that's like, you won't get out unless you put in. And sometimes it's just a matter of reaching out to another pastor, another leader, another friend. And I have a friend that's in ministry, and I reach out to a friend that's out of ministry as well. I want different perspectives, and just like, hey, can we go set a time for coffee? And it doesn't matter if it's a month. It doesn't matter if it's 6 weeks from now. I want to make sure that I am putting into people and putting myself out there of saying, like, hey, I want a real sense of community as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, last question. Here we go. I'm going to end with this one. This one, some little context. Relevant posted about Jared, and this was one of the comments or questions that was posted after, the news came out about Jared. It says this. It says, in light of all the hard things that have happened this past week, what's the best way to show your people that you love them? And as you think about your church, you think about your friends, your family, brothers, sisters, whatever it is, like in ministry, what do you think for y'all individually is the best way to show the people that you love them and that you care about them?
I'll say this. I immediately, whenever I heard that what happened with Jared, I picked up the phone and I called one of our guys that has served on our leadership team, but he's not anymore, because I know that he's dealt with depression. And I immediately just called him and I just was candid with him. I said, listen, I know you probably just heard that this happened. I just want to ask you, how are you doing? Where are you at? And then I just said, will you please just call me if you're feeling in a dark place? I said, please call me. I named a couple of our friends, and he just told me, said, you don't know how much this phone call means to me, And I just think that there's been other times where I felt like I should call him or call other people and I didn't, but for whatever reason, I just felt like I need to call him right there. And I think that communicates to people. We just have to be there for them and be available to them and not just get caught up in building our churches, but in actually caring for the lives of the people God's entrusted to us. So sometimes it's a phone call. Sometimes it's a stop everything and lock in and look at someone in their face, So
I just want to end with this for everyone listening. Listen, if you are struggling with depression, with suicide, with anxiety, first of all, let me just say this. You are not alone. There is nothing quote unquote wrong with you. There is nothing like that you need to be ashamed of. There is nothing that you need to hide from in that stuff. And part of the heart of this podcast is we're here to help. We're here to do whatever we can. So if you are struggling and you don't feel like you can go to anybody or you can talk to anybody, I want you to know you can contact us. I'll answer it. I'll respond to you on Twitter. It's called podcast. DM it and I'll respond to you, and I'll try to connect you with pastors and counselors in your area. Anything that we can do to help you be healthy, anything that we can help you do to finish the race that God has called you to. And the whole reason that we named this podcast Called was because we understand that ministry is not a job, that it is a calling. And all of us in here, not only do we need each other to help us finish this calling, but we need the grace of God. And so I just want to say thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. We can't wait to be back next week. We love you guys, and thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Called Podcast. If you like the show, be sure to leave us a review, subscribe, and tell your friends. Also, be sure to follow us on Twitter at Called Podcast.
Relevant Podcast Network.